Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to visit with us and talk a little bit about asset management using the Altiris platform. We're going to talk today about how we can integrate that tool with the with service management platforms. We're going to talk about Cherwell. We're going to talk about Remedy. We're going to talk about ServiceNow, and of course the Altiris ServiceDesk. And today, to lead off our discussion, we have a couple of very senior technicians who have been doing this for quite a while. We have Paul Manfredi and we have Andrew Boone. And Paul has been doing this and working with me for the better part of the last 15 years or so. And Andrew has similarly been working on this for about 10 years or so. And so both have had tremendous success dealing with the Altiris platform and working with all the aspects of service management that are so critical to a successful implementation that goes into putting together all the process and building out workflows and all of the different steps that make a successful asset integration with your service desk. And really what it's towards is driving value in your organization. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Paul to take over and please share with us all the knowledge that you can.
Great. Thank you, Mike. And thanks for that great intro. Can everyone hear me okay? Mike, can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
All right, great. I just wanted to echo Mike's sentiment. I'd like to thank all our participants for taking the time this morning to join us. I know everyone's got a busy schedule. And again, just thanks for taking part in our discussion, and I'll try to keep it as concise as possible. In today's webinar, we're going to look at the value that the asset management data can provide the business when integrated into the service management platform. Andrew and I will specifically touch on different approaches to integrating the wealth of data that asset management provides into the industry's most widely used service management offerings. Mike touched on 4 of those platforms that we're going to talk about today. We'll look at what it takes from a planning point of view and also the different approaches that can be used to make Symantec's asset management data available to those different platforms. Andrew and I will discuss different projects that we've worked on integrating Symantec's asset management suite and also Symantec workflow solution with BMC's Remedy for CMDB, the ServiceNow offering, Cherwell service management tool, and of course, Symantec ServiceDesk platform. So the ultimate goal of today's presentation is to provide you with the best practices approach when planning to integrate your company's asset data into your ServiceDesk tool in your environment. We'll present some of the different options available to you and some important details around each one of those that can help shape your decision on which approach to take in your environment. As with previous seminars and webinars we've done, we'll go through the slide deck, and I believe Mike will be moderating the questions at the tail end of the presentation. I do welcome your input to enter into the Zoom chat window, but in the interest of time management, we like to save your questions until the end of the presentation, and we can take them in a forum. And at that point, we'll open it up to the forum and Q&A and open discussions. All right, let's get started. So introductions. For those of you new to our webinars, I'd like to start off by introducing myself. My name is Paul Manfredi, and I'm a senior systems engineer here at Intuitive Technology Group in the professional services team. I'm based out of Los Angeles, and I cover accounts nationwide. I've been working with the Altiris platform probably since late 2006 and have been here at ITG since early 2012. I'm a certified Symantec engineer and instructor going back to the Altiris 6 days. My main area of focus is the endpoint management suite with specialization in both ITMS and asset management implementations. So a lot of history around upgrading, implementing, integrating the platform in enterprise environments, probably back to Windows 2000. Mike, would you like to do a quick intro well, I'm sorry, go ahead, please, Andrew, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself, and then maybe we'll just a couple of quick notes on Intuitive, and then we'll dive in.
Sure. My name is Andrew Boone. I've been working with Altiris since, I guess, around 6.8. So maybe, I think late 2008-ish. And been doing workflows since probably towards the end of 2009. I'm also certified with Altiris with that IT suite. But the bulk of my 9+ years previous to today have been spent doing workflow development almost primarily, and integrating disparate systems, such as some of these service management platforms we're going to discuss today, and the Altiris platform, as well as some custom projects themselves being integrated both ways. So I guess, Mike, if you want to have a quick chat about Intuitive. Thanks, Paul.
Absolutely. So Intuitive Technology Group has been working with Symantec for the better part of 12 years at this point. And we've developed our practice around, we started around the endpoint management, but we've certainly expanded and adapted as time has gone on. And at this point, we are spending a lot of our time in some of the, what were traditionally part of the Blue Coat and some of the other acquisitions that have come over the past years. But really our roots are what we're talking about today. And so I'm excited to talk about that. As an organization, we do enablement for our customers in a variety of ways. We have training, we have consulting, and we have staffing opportunities so that we can meet our customers where they need help, whether it's just giving them a point in the right direction, or helping them through a project, or even leaving some folks behind to continue on with the work. We can certainly help you in all those facets. In terms of focus areas, security is a big one for us. In addition to that, we are strong in DevOps, in big data, and Lean Agile. So in other words, we deal a lot with business process and integrating IT into the organization. And all of those four pieces really fit into our combined message of helping our customers perform their jobs better and more efficiently, and help squeeze the costs out of running their IT departments. So that's a little bit about Intuitive. And again, as Paul mentioned, I'll be monitoring the chats. So please feel free to shoot any questions you may have. I'll try to insert them during the conversation where it makes sense, as well as sweeping them all up at the end of the conversation. So again, everybody, thank you for your time today. And with that, Paul and Andrew, please take over.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, today's agenda for our discussion is mainly broken down into two main topics. First off, we're going to talk a little bit about the considerations around integrating your existing asset management environment into your service management platform. So we'll talk about some ideas and thoughts around your existing environment. And then, as with any project, making sure that we set appropriate scope and business goals around that project, and make sure we stay on path with that. We'll also talk about the value add of your asset data into service management. So where we see that typically with customers, there's ideas around those sub-processes and where specifically asset data provides value to those. And the next part of the discussion will be past integration project examples. So we're going to talk about these 4 today. The first one being a direct export of asset management data, which is technically an integration, but it's really more of just making the data available to any platform that wants to ingest it. The next one will be using the Cherwell service management platform to create a database link between Altiris and Cherwell to address or to view the asset data via the Cherwell user interface. And then I'm going to hand it over to Andrew, where he's going to walk us through the a flow that he did using Symantec workflow solution to automatically generate service tickets in the ServiceNow platform and automatically close them. Just putting some automation around, I believe it was a self-service portal, but I'll let Andrew get us into that when the time comes. And finally, we're going to look at a direct integration between Symantec ServiceDesk and Altiris Asset Management, where we're pulling real data live. This is probably the tightest of the 4 integration examples that we're going to go through today. And then we're going to wrap it up with the Q&A session. All right, so as far as AMS integration considerations go, the main ones we have here are the level of maturity around your asset processes. So before attempting an integration between asset and service management platforms, you'll want to examine your existing asset management processes and fully understand any gaps that currently exist so they can be closed before moving forward. When implementing Asset Management Suite, I typically create a detailed design document that will contain all the data elements of the asset resource model, along with all the business processes supported by that asset data. This helps greatly when creating the integration points and what exact data classes will be used to port the asset data from asset management to the service management platform. So here are a few examples of those processes, which would include, your basic hardware lifecycle, software acquisition, distribution, and then retirement and disposal of both hardware and software assets. This is by means not a complete listing of asset-related processes, and a lot of these actually have branched out sub-processes. But depending on the complexity and asset governance rules in your environment, there can be many others. So just a word of caution to please, make sure you put the proper effort into the planning phase of that integration. The next key consideration is the scope. So as with any project, it's important to define the detailed scope of what exact data elements you're looking at integrating between asset and service management. As important is defining the business need being addressed and the value being delivered and derived by each of the data elements. This will greatly assist in limiting the data being brought into the service management platform. So typically, we scrutinize the need for that data to be imported or made available. For example, if a service request ticket is placed for a software installation of Microsoft project on a specific endpoint, we would define the software inventory data of the endpoint as a required data element, as well as the software availability metrics of MS Project as required. So these data elements would be key to understanding and answering questions like, is the software already installed? Is it the version being requested? Are there any on-hand licenses available in our software pool? Those sorts of questions. Here's an example of a resource data model that I produced as part of the documentation phase of a recent implementation of Asset Management Suite. It was later used to integrate several of the resource types into Remedy Force as part of a larger corporate-wide CMDB project. So I like to map these out. I think it's important to map out the asset data model to ensure that we're capturing all the data elements and then providing all the required fields based on our business stakeholders information gathering phase of the project. The data map diagram during my project, I use it as a visual representation. I think it's easy to discuss and disseminate that information to the people involved in the project, and even modifying it during those meetings or group settings. Again, it'll always be backed up by a full software design document, which provides further details around each of the data elements and relationships between them. I know it's a little grainy, but all of those arrows essentially are the relationships, either hierarchical or resource association, and all the columns would be your data, your resource types and data classes for each. So looking at the AMS value proposition when integrating into service management, when we extend the asset data beyond the view of the asset manager, we can derive further value in any of the use cases which interact with service management on a daily basis. We know that a lack of accurate data equates to a capital loss. So it's no stretch to build in a sub-processes in the daily service management tasks that will interact with the very same assets in order to keep up with them or keep them up to date whenever possible. I think apart from physical inventory, the service desk teams are the best positioned team to both leverage information about the end user's equipment in which they are assisting, and also to update those records in the event of any discrepancies that they come across while working a ticket, for example. The two platforms working together to provide a complete view of the asset and all related history around it is the ultimate goal by integrating both platforms. Cases such as, for example, dealing with a zero-day patch remediation to HR offboarding, asset recovery are all facilitated with accurate visibility into the asset data from the service desk team. Software license and compliance and hardware asset end of lease retrieval are two of the biggest cost-saving measures that I go after when on an asset management project. And this is always going to have a service management component to it. So for example, moving clients away from simply processing an installation from a service request for a new piece of software to actually working in a seamless sub-process with the asset management team is easily validated. Is there an on-hand license available in the license pool before sending the request for purchase, those types of things. These types of efficiency gains will sum up over time to considerable savings. So I've just bulleted out the main pieces we look at. Hardware asset end of lease for customers is always challenging. I come across it, on every engagement, whether it's end of lease or life cycle replacement in the event of purchased assets. But more so in a highly distributed environment. So where we've got a lot of branch locations away from the core corporate campuses, the visibility tends to weaken. Forecasting replacement and just tracking down these endpoints can be a considerable undertaking. So by connecting asset management with the service management platform, the service desk team can be made aware when the lease contract is coming to an end, in some cases potentially saving efforts on endpoint repair or reinstallations, as well as providing a benefit back to the asset management teams about updating asset details. Okay, let's take a look at the various AMS integration examples. So the first example here is going to be the data export, and that's essentially where we make the data available for any platform to import or access. So the first example for data integration is that simple method of making the asset management data available to any external platform. In one of my most recent projects, this was the method that was followed. After determining that due to the fact that the service management platform, in this case was Remedy Force, it was hosted as a cloud offering on a subscription basis. And there were some internal policy restrictions that essentially made it impossible for a direct database connection or a web service call to be made into that cloud environment. So what we did was we created essentially a set of data exports that we'll look at here in a second. And we made that data available with those data exports using the Altiris internal data connector solution to build those individual resource type exports.
So Paul, was that more of an operational requirement type of integration, or was it a security restriction that caused you to not be able to make that database connection and have to do the exports?
The customer, it was not their private cloud. It was the cloud being offered by the provider of the service desk offering. So I believe the decision was made to not build a direct connection between the two for security reasons. So building those resource type exports is really a two-step procedure that had to be put into place, where we'd make them available, and then in this case the Pentaho data integration suite was used to map that corresponding data and those data class fields directly into the Remedy Force side. So the bulk of the effort was around building the individual exports for the various resource types. And that was for all resource types. And when I say all, I mean, the first set of exports were structural data types. So the location listing, financial, cost center information, departmental, user-based information, all those structural data types. And then the next was the fixed asset types that were in scope. So all of the fixed assets, computers, servers, phones, tablets, whatever was in there. And lastly was the license-based metrics to provide that granularity around those individual software titles, speaking to software license compliance, for example. So here's an example of what the data connector export source looked like for those. We used CSV-based format for those. The export source that was created specifically for Remedy Force computer asset type is the screenshot that I've got up here on the screen with its respective data attributes. So the way it works is that the data export rule defines certain parameters around how the export file will be created. For instance, the CSV file contains column headers, which will be used for the data attributes that we'll see in the next slide. It also defines the export location of the flat file in .csv format. And lastly, options on whether to create the file if it doesn't exist or overwriting the file. That last option is important because it ensures that the exported file, in this case, computer_asset.csv, will always be the most up-to-date. And we'll see the schedule here in the next slide based on the export rule, the corresponding export rule to go with this source. So once the data connector export source is defined, we can go ahead and create the export rule. The export rule will first define the data source. So the source we saw a moment ago would be displayed in the data source field at the top. Next, the actual report that will query the database and return the specific data attributes we need for export to Remedy Force. It's worth noting here that this step of creating a custom SQL query for each resource type was needed, where custom data classes existed and were also business requirements in the Remedy Force platform. So if you see up here at the export report, there's one here called GC Computer Assets. And what that is that's the custom report that'll render those report columns that we're looking for. The next section of the rule takes care of the mapping between the results of the SQL query and the column headers in the CSV flat file. If you notice here, I also have several GUID-based column mappings. And the reason for this is that they're the resource associations to other resource types. So if you see the user GUID here, we see in the screenshot, that'll associate the computer to the computer's asset user owner for that computer. The caveat here is that all the structural data needs to exist before trying to associate the imports on the service management platform, or it won't find that associated GUID to create the association. So this is easily dealt with by scheduling the exports to time the structural data to always be created prior to that asset data being imported or created. Okay, the next example here we're going to look at is linking the asset management database or the Symantec CMDB database to Cherwell Service Management. So this project involved integration of Altiris asset inventory data in Cherwell. The business goals here were to increase efficiency in the service desk team by providing them with the real-time asset data when working incident-based tickets. The solution was to link the Cherwell data to the Altiris database on the back end as a data source. So in the next couple of slides, we'll briefly look at the steps involved and the connection configuration aspects between Altiris and Cherwell SM using linked data between the two databases. Initially, there were two paths we could have followed for this project. The first being a scheduled import of the asset data into Cherwell, and the second being that linked connection from Altiris to Cherwell. We ultimately chose the linked database connection because of concern that importing the data would create divergence in the data sets over time, whereas linking them gave us the opportunity to maintain the Altiris data in the CMDB only, and only leveraging or using it when it was accessed by Cherwell. So linked database connection, it's going to be initiated on the Cherwell side, and I put a couple of screenshots in here. Cherwell is very wizard driven. It's a very easy tool to work with when building out these connection type scenarios. Linking the Symantec Altiris database to Cherwell happens in its UI using that external connection wizard. we would start by running what's called the external connection wizard from within that Cherwell UI and select create a new database to a SQL server and use the default SQL pooling, that sort of thing. The next step would be to define the database location. In our case, we browse to the SQL server where the Symantec data CMDB was located, and then prompted for login credentials. So the connection properties are set using the SQL account credentials with appropriate rights to the Symantec CMDB database. Once that's configured and tested, the configuration file in Cherwell that's known as a blueprint is saved and published. And that's really it as far as the connection. So once that connection to the database is established, we can move forward and create database views. So the database views in Cherwell need to be created for the asset types that are being defined. As with the first option we looked at a second ago, using flat files, the views required will be a similar breakdown between hardware and software asset data elements. In Cherwell, these resource types are known as business objects. So each of the resource types we want to expose in Cherwell would need corresponding views for that asset data created. We can see in the Cherwell interface, using the create new database server objects in one of those screenshots I have up, these views essentially are SQL scripts that will render the query results for each of the Altiris resource types being queried. So once those views have been created, again, we go ahead and save that blueprint or publish it if we're finished. So we've now got the connection to the data and the database views for the resource types we need. The next point, the next step would be mapping and importing those views into Cherwell's existing business objects. So using those, using the views we created to their corresponding Cherwell business objects is the name of the game here. The external data wizard again is used here to complete this step. We will need to map each individual field from each of those views in the business object. So this is done with the fields map page that we see here at the in the screenshot. Next, we'll add the Cherwell unique key. So this is essentially what we know of as the Altiris GUID, and we use the Altiris GUID to map this field as the unique key in Cherwell straight out of our asset database. And finally, we'll add a timestamp. For the timestamp here, we use the agent/check-in timestamp field. So once all these fields have been mapped, we can go ahead and finish up with the data wizard, importing the Altiris view data into the Cherwell business objects. Again, here is the final step once the mappings have been completed. So for this step, the external data import wizard again was used. We chose the resource types, and we update the existing records in the Cherwell service management interface. Again, linking the two databases here, we now have exposed that data in Cherwell for the service management users. So again, we get all the same value, and this is essentially live data. The drawback of doing it this way, as opposed to the import, there can be some latency in the interface that we did experience, as opposed to imports. So those are the first two examples. The next example, I'm going to pass it over to Andrew, who's going to walk us through example around ServiceNow workflow and ServiceDesk, Symantec ServiceDesk.
Thanks, Paul.
I'm just going to pass
like,
over.
Yeah, my control has been revoked.
There you go.
All right, let me make sure my clicks are working here. All right, so again, my name is Andrew. I'm Intuitive's resident workflow guy, and being such, a lot of the approaches that we take to integration, often the concept of using workflow development and any custom integration comes up, and I think Paul could likely attest to that. A lot of my work comes from Paul's initial asset work at our customers, and he's able to describe the benefits that we've seen at other customer sites based on the automation and the integration capabilities of the workflow platform. The great thing also about workflow is that when you have Altiris licenses of almost any kind, you are entitled to the workflow platform. So that's not a purchase; it's an entitlement given to you with your licenses. So really, the effort comes in with planning out your business process and then converting that into workflow development and publish, and then there's your automation. It's in place and it works. So given that, we were approached by a customer that wanted to integrate a lot of the asset work and a lot of the asset data that they had with a new initiative they were launching with ServiceNow. And I had done some ServiceNow work in the past, and also had done some articles on Connect and things like that of how to do the basics of integration with ServiceNow from a workflow perspective. And a few excerpts from that article are here. It's very easy to not only integrate with ServiceNow, but anything that has exposed web services, and that includes the Altiris platform, which also has its own pretty expansive set of web services that can be called using this same example. So in this example of ServiceNow, we basically provide a URL. Now on the ServiceNow side, that can be a custom URL designed for a custom process. Or as you can see here in this screenshot, the lower screenshot example, it's basically part of the URL. It's incident.do. And then we plop in the WSDL and then an extra parameter that basically indicates that we're qualified to do this, and then that's checked on the ServiceNow side to ensure that security is all set up properly and etc. To use this web service. That being said, if we wanted to do change management instead, we would use the name of that table instead of incident.do. If we had a custom table called custom table, we would do custom table.do. And what this web service generator is going to do is it's going to query that URL for the expected parameters. It's going to read the WSDL, and it's going to parse all that data. It's going to combine that and create for us a number of components that are ready to use on the workflow canvas. And the point of this is that we want to have a data structure or a data object that is the proper shape that's expected of a payload that's going to whatever destination we have in mind. In this case, ServiceNow expects its incident to be in a certain object format. By querying the URL, the web service generator is able to then build an object frame that is going to match and is deliverable then to the ServiceNow web service. And as Paul had mentioned before, just like Cherwell itself is wizard driven, so is this part of the workflow library. So we're just generating web service components via a wizard, into which we're typing things like the URL and authentication tokens and things like that. Once that component's created, all we need to do then is reload our project or load in the new library with that web service caller component. We can use an insert or a delete if that's what we need. In this case, we have a screenshot here of the start of an insert mapping component. And anyone familiar with ServiceNow incident ticket, for example, we'll see some familiar concepts and familiar field names. So we can map over whatever data we pulled in, whether we've pulled that from a custom entry point, custom interface. Any asset data that we pulled in, we can send that over as an attached asset. We can send over location information as a CI there for location or department. And even user can be done that way. There's oftentimes, different data sources for different purposes. You're probably not going to be getting user from the same place you're getting your computers. If you've got it set up to, pull from AD, you may do one or the other. But the cool thing about using workflow to integrate the two is that it's very easy to create these components and then just map over whatever data you have available, whether that's from automated fetching or user input. We can map that right in to the ServiceNow incident ticket, or if we're just going to push over data from Altiris itself. Another initiative that we had was to provide, using workflow, as a web service itself. So we created a project in workflow and then published it as a web service that then ServiceNow would consume. And ServiceNow, when doing a user lookup, then would reach out to Altiris and fetch that user's assets, computer assets, tablets, monitors, everything that Altiris knew about the assets for that user would be fetched and put into either a drop-down list or a search window, whichever is most appropriate. In this case, we use the search window. And then those two have been associated already with data imports. So basically, you select one and then it associates it. But ServiceNow doesn't have to worry whether it's their current asset, because Altiris is already installed. It's gathering inventory. You switch monitors, that's going to happen automatically on the Altiris side. So then the data in new tickets in ServiceNow is always fresh, because we're doing those live fetches. So generally speaking, we can also pull in data from ServiceNow into custom forms and then send that data back with data we've fetched to correlate to ServiceNow. So let's say that we have a source of truth for users and we want to use ServiceNow for that. But we also have a custom interface that we're using for something on the Altiris side. We can fetch user data from ServiceNow, do whatever we're doing in our custom interface, and then send all that back to ServiceNow as a ticket. So not only can we pull, we can also push, and then combine those two to make as complex or as simple a process as you want, and basically map all those over. Again, inside of the article there on Connect, there's a lot of data and information there to read about, and any help you might need, feel free to reach out and we can talk. How that works, the ServiceNow to workflow to Altiris connections. And here's just a screenshot then of the demo lab that I have, where I've integrated my Altiris lab with workflow to pull in things like configuration item being a computer in this case. And this was part of a patch automation demo. So basically, we'll say that in this case, I think it was that we had a defective patch, is what we'll call it, that for some reason it wasn't being installed on this machine. So through the interface that was reporting to us that we had some failed installations to a machine, Through that interface, we basically had a button to say create a ticket. And that's all we had to do is click that button, create a ticket for this machine. And then that button on the back end on the workflow side did all the mapping that ServiceNow expected, compiled that into a proper object for payload, and then sent it over. And milliseconds later, this ticket is created and sent over to the appropriate owner, a queue, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter. What platform we use, we can do this the same way. And speaking of any platform, we can do this with any platform. That's the power of workflow, is to integrate disparate systems, integrate systems that may not talk well to one another, and to be that middleman. And because of that, at one point in the past, Symantec decided, well, let's use this to build our own ServiceDesk product. So ServiceDesk itself is built on the workflow engine. So there's not really a middleman needed there because it's already built on the power that is workflow. And that being the case, right out of the box, ServiceDesk is configured to already integrate into asset management and your Altiris and Symantec platforms. In this screenshot here, you can see just a custom lab version that I built that pulls AD information, it pulls asset information or asset options per user, and then we can send that right over to ServiceDesk very easily with a single form, a single submit button. And what that does is once you send that over, it automatically maps in everything that we need for assets. And this is just a screenshot of behind the scenes with workflow, is basically the related assets to a ticket is just a series of fields that we map over. It contains the asset GUID, asset description, the resource type GUID, so we know what type of asset it is, as well as a few other fields there that end up being part of the link that we see here at the bottom. So basically, when this ServiceDesk ticket is created, it's created with all of the custom work that we may have put into it, as well as some of the baked-in subroutines that then take any asset we provided and builds out a link that sends you right over to the notification server URL and loads in that asset. So you can see the asset, you can see its relationship to any other associated assets in the environment, or in the Altiris, I guess we'll call that resource association diagram. And it makes it very easy to move from one to the other. So you can move from ServiceDesk back to Altiris very easily to view things like, what's going on with this machine? Well, the user sees one thing, they type in what they see, and then they submit. And they've also provided their user ID, which we've used to fetch all their data. And then they pick out which machine they're having problems with. Maybe they just have a single machine, maybe they have many, but they're able to see it because we fetched it from the CMDB. Once that's in here, they click it. The analyst or the technician can click it and then review all the Altiris information about that resource, and it helps them track down the problem. So that being said, I'll pass it back to Paul. There was a lot of information there. Any questions, just let me know, and I'll go over any more of that is needed.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. So as always, part of our webinar series is the offering of a free or a complimentary assessment of your existing Altiris environment. So if any of you are on the call are interested, please feel free to reach out. My email address is down there. And we'll have a recording of the webinar up on our YouTube page that I believe, if you need links to it, you should be able to just look for Intuitive Technology on YouTube, and the series of webinars should come up. Mike, I'll pass it back to you for Q&A, and we'll wrap up.
Okay, well, we've got a number of good ones. So one question that came in was, this is maybe not directly in the scope of the presentation, but is it possible for AMS to meter or monitor platform as a service or software as a service applications or subscriptions? Example being Office 365.
To meter their usage?
I'm going to take a guess and assume that it'd be tracking the licensing against one of those services, but that's...
Well, I mean, the subscription-based ones that are going to be cloud-based licenses, but if we, there are always remnants. Example, O365, unless it's the pure cloud implementation of it, there are going to be remnants on the machine that we are going to be able to go after, yes. And as long as we can understand the event and the specific executable that runs, we can generate metrics on those installations. But if it's pure cloud-based, then we won't have any visibility into it.
Okay, so perhaps another way to it also would be in terms of the entitlement, assuming that we could pull that subscription information from either a purchasing database or some other direction as well to identify the entitlement to it.
Yeah, there's going to be a portion of it.
Of finding an artifact on the machine
exactly
to tie to that.
Yep.
Okay. So here's a little politics to insert. My organization is struggling with the decision about which CMDB should be considered the source of truth, my ServiceNow instance or my Altiris instance. Any advice on which one should rule, and what sort of tie-ins do I need in place to have the one update the other, or allow my help desk staff to update them, excuse me?
As a general rule, we tend to call the source of truth the one that's most downstream. So in this case, it would be ServiceNow, because it being more of a unidirectional flow of data from Altiris to ServiceNow. From the ServiceNow perspective, Altiris would essentially, or the asset data would essentially become a data source for the larger CMDB. And this doesn't only apply to ServiceNow. It's any of those service management platforms that incorporates especially change into it. Hope that helps.
Okay. And then the follow-up is what sort of tiebacks would I want to create back to Altiris from my service desk? I'm assuming this is towards some of the integration examples that Andrew was showing.
Yeah, I think Andrew can speak to this more, but some actionable ones. I know that he's leveraged things like deploying software jobs and tasks directly from the ServiceNow interface. Maybe you want to touch on that, Andrew?
Sure. I mean, there's also I've developed things like just small buttons to do things like enable patch policies when change tickets have been fully approved. That can also just be automated as part of the ServiceNow orchestration. But I mean, really, it like I was mentioning before, it can go both ways. Whether you want to have things like maybe an asset's status or location, something like that, updated in ServiceNow, and you can stay in the ServiceNow interface. And again, as Paul mentioned, that can go for any one of these platforms that can also reach back, whether that's through workflow or whether directly to Altiris. And you can update those values right from the console that everybody's familiar with. So yeah, it definitely goes both ways quite easily. You need somebody
Okay.
on staff that knows how to program that, because it's not as simple as just drag and dropping something in ServiceNow. For example, you got to code that button and then have it reach the right URL with the right parameters and things like that. So
Okay. So I also have a question of what level of effort is required to integrate the software license availability to reality on the ground? How do I make this visible to my help desk staff prior to doing installation? How do I fit this into the process? So guessing that it's a little bit more of a straight asset question to my mind, and as well as process.
Sure, it's always going to be supported by process, but essentially here we're going to go get the software license compliance metrics out of the asset database and present those, and those will answer questions around software entitlement on that endpoint when that incident comes in requesting that piece of software. It'll really become the go-to source of information in the service management tool.
Okay, and then the final question that I have was, my company is considering moving to a hosted solution. If I have an externally hosted help desk, what sort of rules do I need to implement to make sure that sensitive data doesn't leak out? Do I have to encrypt my exports, or is an HTTPS connection sufficient? I think this gets towards things like DLP and CASB, even more so than necessarily the integration piece. But Paul or Andrew, do you have a thought on that? And I can certainly weigh in with some thoughts around CASB as well.
This is Andrew. I'll get mine out of the way quickly. It's probably some pretty basic information, but I know with ServiceNow, that being entirely cloud-based for the most part, there is a MID server that sits local to whatever data center you're using, and can do things like upload AD imports and things like that. And that server and its connections can be hardened to your security team's heart's content. As far as the degree of that, I guess that's really just up to the team that's observing those packets going back and forth. Best practice, I probably can't speak to that, but I do know that there are measures, especially for ServiceNow, that are in place to move that back and forth in a secure manner.
Sounds good. I guess for my purposes, I would simply add to that this is one we probably want to take offline and pull in a couple of our folks who are more well versed on the CASB and DLP side of things. But I do think those are probably some of the answers you want to look at to make sure that whatever data might be going through that connector isn't causing you to fall out of compliance in terms of either PCI HIPAA or whatever the STIGs, whatever the security standard that you need to host or to hold to. So I would say I'd be happy to follow up on that particular one with you, but generally I think that would be, I think that some of your ingress and egress policies in those other types of security solutions should be measured against this, and I'm sure your security team would be happy to have that exercise with you. So I'll put out a last call for questions. And during that time, I'll also mention for those folks who would like to, next week, we are at the same time, we'll be hosting a webinar regarding web isolation and how that impacts security. And so it's going to be going after some of the most common attack vectors, such as email and browser, and showing how you can address those things. That, for what it's worth, that's actually a Gartner top technology for the second year in a row in terms of protecting your environment. I'd also mention, with regards to that last question, we do actually have 2 of our previous 3 webinars were on CASB and DLP, and also proxy, all dealing with ingress and egress. So I would encourage you to check out those webinar recordings as well. In the meantime, it looks like we don't have any more questions, so I'd like to thank everybody for your time. Thank you to Paul and Andrew for sharing this content with us, and we look forward to seeing you next week on our next webinar. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.